There are places in the American West where civilization arrived late and left early. Caldwell Bluff, Texas was one of those places. In the summer of 1878, it had one church with a leaking roof, one saloon with 3 bullet holes in the door, one general store run by a man who was afraid of everything, and one medical person, not a doctor. Doctors didn't come to Caldwell Bluff. Doctors went to places that could pay them. What Caldwell Bluff had was Margaret Elise Dowd, age 32, a trained nurse and the daughter of a frontier army surgeon. She had learned medicine the way frontier children learn everything, by watching carefully, asking questions, and doing the thing herself when there was nobody else to do it. Margaret had come to Caldwell Bluff 3 years ago, following a man she had planned to marry. The man had lasted 8 months before the frontier convinced him he was better suited to somewhere else. Margaret had stayed. Not because she had nowhere to go. Because she had looked at Caldwell Bluff and understood that if she left, there would be nobody. Nobody to set the broken bones. Nobody to deliver the babies. Nobody to sit with the dying at 3 in the morning when the dying needed someone to sit with them. She had stayed because she was needed. It was that simple and that complicated. She was a small woman, brown-haired, with a practical face. The kind of face that people trusted immediately. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was honest. Every thought she had showed up there eventually. She couldn't hide what she felt, which was sometimes inconvenient and always useful. She lived in 2 rooms behind the general store. 1 room for sleeping, and 1 room for everything else. The everything else room had an examination table she had built herself, shelves of medicines she ordered from San Antonio, and a chair beside the window where she sat in the evenings, reading medical journals 3 months out of date and watching Caldwell Bluff go about its difficult business. She knew everyone in town, their histories, their ailments, and their fears. She knew which men drank too much, which women were unhappy, which children weren't eating enough. She knew all of it because people told her things they told nobody else. Because she was the nurse. And the nurse was the person you told things to when there was no one else. On the morning of July 14, 1878, Margaret Elise Dowd was doing 3 things at once: boiling instruments, reading a letter from her sister in Baltimore, and ignoring the sound of horses on the main street. Horses on the main street were not unusual. Then the sound changed. Too many horses. Too fast, too loud. She went to the window. 7 riders coming in hard from the north road, guns already drawn. She recognized the man in front immediately. Not because she had met him, but because his face was on the wanted poster nailed to the wall of the sheriff's office, which she passed every single day. The most wanted man in West Texas, responsible for 4 bank robberies, 2 stagecoach holdups, and 3 deaths. Margaret watched Red Donahue and his 6 men ride into Caldwell Bluff. She watched the sheriff, a decent but cautious man named Walt Briggs, come out of his office. She watched what happened next. It was fast, it was brutal. And when it was over, Sheriff Walt Briggs was on the ground, alive but badly hurt. And Red Donahue was standing in the middle of Caldwell Bluff's main street like he owned it. Which, for the moment, he did. Margaret was already moving. She picked up her medical bag. She walked out her front door. She crossed the street. She knelt beside Sheriff Briggs. Red Donahue watched her from 10 feet away. He said, "What do you think you're doing?" Margaret didn't look up. She said, "My job." She said it the way she said everything. Simply, clearly, without performance. Clearly, without performance. Red Donahue looked at her for a moment. He said, "You have nerve, woman." Red Donahue watched her for a long moment. Then he laughed, not unkindly, and walked away. Margaret noted that. She noted everything. It was how she had survived 3 years on the frontier. By paying attention to everything, especially the things that seemed small. She got Walt Briggs inside and stable. She came back out to find Red Donahue sitting on the steps of the saloon, his men spread out through the town, controlling every exit. He looked at her when she came out. He said, "How is he?" She said, "He'll live. If he rests and doesn't do anything foolish." Donahue said, "Good." She stared at him. He said, "I didn't come here to kill anyone. I came here because one of my men is sick. Very sick. I heard there was a medical person in this town." He looked at her directly. He said, "I need your help." Margaret Elise Dowd stood in the middle of Caldwell Bluff's main street, with 7 outlaws around her, A wounded sheriff inside, and the most wanted man in West Texas looking at her, asking for her help. She thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Show me your man." The man on the bed was Billy Donahue, 23 years old, and the younger brother of the man they called Red. He'd had a fever for 5 long days, a fever that was still climbing. And there was the wound in his side, raw, angry, and completely untreated. Margaret took one look, and the gravity of the situation hit her like a physical blow. The infection was bad, the kind that claims a life in 2 more days if left to fester. She looked up at Red, her voice steady. "How long has he been like this?" 5 days, Red answered, his own voice low and rough. "Why did you wait?" she asked, a sharp edge to her tone. He shifted his weight, the look on his face one of a man who knew he'd made a grave error. "We were moving." Margaret repeated his words, but they came out flat, devoid of understanding. "You were moving." Red didn't reply, but his expression soured. He didn't need her to spell out his mistake. She didn't press the point. There was no time. She was already on her knees, unpacking her medical bag. The contents were meager, but they would have to do. "I need hot water, clean cloth, and someone to hold a lamp steady." Red didn't hesitate. He sent 2 of his men scrambling for water and took the oil lamp himself, his large hand surprisingly gentle as he held it. For the next 2 hours, Margaret worked tirelessly on Billy. It was a grim, painstaking process. She cleaned the wound, debriding the dead tissue with a focus that shut out the rest of the world. The smell was awful, the sight even worse, but she didn't flinch. Every movement was precise, economical, born of years of experience in patching up men who had run out of luck. Through it all, Red stood at the head of the bed, a silent, unmoving sentinel. He held that lamp perfectly still, the circle of light never wavering, and he talked to his brother, a constant, low murmur. The kind of voice you use when you're trying to anchor someone to this world, when you're pleading with them just to stay, to hold on a little longer. He told stories from their childhood, reminded Billy of a fishing trip, of the time they'd stolen apples from Old Man McGregor's orchard. His voice was a lifeline, a thread of sound in the tense, quiet room. When Margaret finally finished, she straightened up, her back aching. She wiped her hands on a rag, her face smudged with grime and sweat. "The fever will get worse before it gets better," she said, her professional tone returning. "He needs at least 3 days of complete rest. No moving him, understand? I'll come back to check the wound twice a day. If that fever spikes, if he starts shaking uncontrollably, you come and get me immediately. Day or night, it doesn't matter." Red looked at her then, really looked at her, his eyes searching her face in the flickering lamplight. There was a flicker of disbelief, of surprise. "You would come?" he asked, as if the idea was foreign to him. Margaret met his gaze without blinking. She began packing her bag, placing each instrument back in its rightful place. "I am a nurse," she said simply. "That is not a question I consider." With her bag packed and her duty done, for now, she turned and walked out of the makeshift tent. She didn't look back. The cold night air was a shock after the heat of the room, but it felt clean. She walked through the camp, the faces she passed a blur. Her mind was already on the next steps, the next visit. Because that's what a nurse does. You don't question the call. You answer it. You show up, you do the work, and you hope it's enough. The next morning she was back as promised. The air in the tent was heavy. Billy was delirious, his skin burning to the touch. The fever had indeed gotten worse. Red was right where she'd left him, a damp cloth in his hand, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He looked up as she entered, a question in his eyes he didn't dare ask. "This is the hard part," she said, setting down her bag. "We just have to see him through it." She changed the dressing, the wound looking no better, but no worse either. That, in itself, was a small victory. She showed Red how to spoon water and broth between Billy's cracked lips, how to keep him cool without chilling him. The day dragged on. The night was even longer. Margaret came and went, a steady, reliable presence in their chaotic world. On the second day, the fever finally broke. It happened just after dawn. One moment, Billy was tossing and turning, lost in a fever dream. The next, he was still. For a terrifying second, Margaret thought they'd lost him. But then she saw the sweat beading on his forehead, a sign the fever's grip was loosening. His breathing, while still shallow, was more even. Red, who had been holding his breath, let it out in a long, shuddering sigh. He sank onto a nearby crate, burying his face in his hands. He didn't make a sound, but his shoulders shook. Margaret pretended not to notice, giving him a moment of privacy. "He's not out of the woods yet," she said softly after a minute. "But he's on the right path." By the fourth day, Billy was awake. He was weak, his voice barely a whisper, but his eyes were clear. He looked at Red, then at Margaret, a question in his gaze. "She saved you," Red said, his voice thick with emotion. Billy's eyes found Margaret's. "Thank you," he whispered. She just nodded, a small smile touching her lips for the first time. "Get some rest, Billy." As she left that day, Red followed her out. He stood before her, awkwardly shifting his weight. He was a man unaccustomed to expressing gratitude, at least in words. He pressed a small, heavy pouch into her hand. "This is for you. It's not enough, but ... Margaret looked at the pouch, then back at him. She pushed his hand away gently. "I told you, I'm a nurse. My payment is seeing him walk out of that tent. You keep your money. Use it to buy him a decent meal when he's strong enough." Red stared at her, utterly baffled. In his world, everything had a price. Every action, every favor, came with a debt to be repaid. This simple, unconditional act of care was something he couldn't comprehend. He just nodded, speechless. Margaret turned to leave, but this time Red spoke again. "Margaret," he said, using her name for the first time. She paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Thank you," he said. And this time the words were not a formality. They were heavy, genuine, filled with a respect he rarely gave. Margaret allowed herself another small smile. "Just keep him safe, Red." Then she walked away, disappearing into the dust and the crowd. Another life saved, another day's work done. She didn't look back because there was always another person who needed her, another call to answer, and she would be ready. Thank you so much for watching this story unfold. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more content like this. We love bringing these narratives to life, and your support makes it all possible. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next upload. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one. That evening, she came back as promised. Billy's fever was higher. She stayed for 2 hours and Red was there the entire time. At one point, he fell asleep in the chair beside his brother's bed. Margaret looked at him sleeping, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, and her mind flashed to the wanted poster. 4 robberies, 2 holdups, 3 deaths. The stark, violent words seemed so at odds with the scene in front of her. But then she pushed the thought away and went back to checking Billy's wound. Because that was the job. The job was the person in front of her, the wound that needed cleaning, the fever that needed tending. Everything else was just noise. On the second day, a new kind of tension filled the air. Red came to her door, not with a gun drawn, but with his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that felt almost ancient. He looked her straight in the eye and asked, "Why are you doing this the way you are doing it?" His voice was low, laced with a genuine confusion. "You could do the minimum and stay safe. No one would blame you, but you are doing it like it matters. Like Billy matters." Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "That is not something I decide case by case. Your brother is 23 years old. He is sick and frightened, and a long way from anywhere safe. That is what I see when I look at him, not the wanted poster." The silence that followed was heavy. Red just looked at her for a long, long time, as if he were trying to see past her skin, into the very core of who she was. Finally, he spoke, his voice filled with a kind of awe. "You are a very unusual woman." A small smile touched Margaret's lips. "I am a frontier nurse," she replied. "Unusual is a requirement." On the third day, the crisis broke. The fever, which had raged like a wildfire, finally receded. Margaret came in that morning and found Billy sitting up in bed. He was pale, thin, and looked utterly exhausted, but he was sitting up. A wave of relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. Billy looked at her with clear eyes, the delirium gone. "Red says you saved my life," he said, his voice weak but earnest. Margaret moved to his bedside, her professional demeanor taking over as she checked his wound. The angry red was gone, replaced by the healthy pink of new skin. "Your brother saved your life," she corrected gently. "He came and got help when you needed it. I just did my job." She finished her checks, satisfied with his progress, and walked toward the door. She was ready to leave, to put this dangerous chapter behind her. But just as she reached the threshold, Red's voice stopped her. "Miss Dowd." There was an urgency in his tone that made her turn around. "There is something you should know." He took a deep breath, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. A man named Victor Crane is coming to Caldwell Bluff in 2 days. He is the reason 3 people are dead. Not me. The confession hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Crane is coming for something hidden here, something worth a great deal of money. When he comes, Red's eyes were dark with certainty. He will not be careful about who gets hurt. Margaret's mind raced. Victor Crane. A new name, a new threat. This wasn't just about a sick outlaw anymore. The entire town was in danger. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice sharp. Red's expression was a mixture of gratitude and grim resignation. "Because this town helped my brother. And because," he looked at her again with that same intensity from before, "you are the kind of person who will do something about it, whether anyone helps you or not." She stood there in the doorway, the morning sun at her back, her world tilting on its axis. She thought about Victor Crane coming in 2 days. She thought about Marshal Walt Briggs, still healing from his own wounds. And she thought about the 7 outlaws camped on her land. Men who were proving to be far more complex than she had ever assumed. The lines between right and wrong, between law and outlaw, were blurring into a messy, dangerous gray. She couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Finally, she made a decision. She looked Red straight in the eye and said, "I will need more information. You had better come inside." Red Donahue picked up his hat from the floor, his shoulders straightening with a new purpose. He followed her inside, and as the door closed behind them, the fate of Caldwell Bluff was sealed, not by a lawman, but by a frontier nurse who believed that everyone mattered. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Victor Crane wasn't like Red Donahue. Red was a criminal, sure, but Victor Crane, he was something worse. Red laid it all out at Margaret's kitchen table, over coffee she'd made just to keep her hands from shaking. 3 years back, he and Crane had hit a bank in Abilene. $40,000. But then Crane betrayed him, tried to have him killed, and pinned 3 deaths on him to make the law chase him down. Red survived and ran. Crane had been hunting him, and that money, ever since. When he finished, she asked the one question that mattered. "Where's the money?" Red flinched, but she was quick to clarify. "I'm not asking because I want it. I'm asking because if I'm going to help you, I need to know everything." "It's under the floorboards of the old Hendricks place," Red admitted. "East of town, been abandoned for 3 years. Margaret nodded, processing. "Victor Crane. And you have 6, she countered. 7, counting Billy." "So 6. Margaret stood and walked to the window, gazing out at Caldwell Bluff. She saw the familiar faces, the general store owner who jumped at his own shadow. The church with its leaky roof, the saloon scarred with bullet holes. This was her town. The town she'd stayed in because it needed someone. It needed her. She turned back to Red. "I mean real help," she pressed, "not just your guns." "Name it. First," she began, "we tell the town." Red stared at her, stunned. "They deserve a chance to prepare, to get their families somewhere safe. If you tell the town, they'll panic," he argued. "Some of them will," she conceded, "but some of them won't. You might be surprised what people do when someone tells them the truth." She let that sink in. "Second, Walt Briggs. The sheriff? And he deserves the chance to be part of whatever we decide." "He'll arrest me," Red stated flatly. "Possibly," Margaret agreed, "but he's a good man. Usually makes the right choice." Red studied her for a long moment. "You trust people a great deal, Miss Dowd." "I trust people exactly as much as they deserve," she replied. "All right, Margaret went to see Walt Briggs first." She told him everything, without leaving a single detail out. Walt listened in complete silence. When she finished, a long quiet settled over the room. "It wasn't a question. I believe the part about Victor Crane," she said. "It fits with things I know about those 3 deaths that never quite made sense." Walt stared at the ceiling for a moment. "I can't fight." "Not yet, I know," Margaret said softly. "There are 3 men here who can handle themselves." He named them, and Margaret wrote the names down. She went to each of them. She told them the unvarnished truth, plainly and completely, the only way she knew how. 2 of the 3 said yes immediately. The 3rd man took his time, thinking it over, and then he said yes, too. She returned to Red Donahue. "We have a plan." He looked up, waiting. "Victor Crane is coming for the money," she said, "so we move the money." Red just stared at her. A man who came for something and found nothing is a man whose plan has already failed. He won't just leave, Red warned. No, she agreed. But he'll be angry, and angry men make mistakes. We need him to make one mistake. Just one. Red looked at her, a flicker of awe in his eyes. You've thought about this carefully. Margaret met his gaze directly. I am extremely afraid. I have been afraid since the moment I saw you ride into town. But fear isn't a reason to stop thinking, or stop working, or stop doing what needs to be done. It's just weather. You work through it. Red Donahue looked at Margaret Elise Dowd, this small, practical woman with brown hair who had stayed in a town no one else wanted, who had treated his brother like a person, made coffee, listened, and forged a plan, all while being terrified. Miss Dowd, he said, his voice full of a respect he rarely gave. I've ridden with a lot of people in my life. Victor Crane arrives tomorrow. We have a great deal to do tonight. I suggest we get started. That very night, they moved the money. It was Red and two of his most trusted men, alongside Margaret and the three townsmen Walt had pointed out. Under the dim, flickering glow of lamplight at the old, abandoned Hendricks place, they found it. The money was right where Red said it would be, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the elements. $40,000. A fortune that could change everything. With careful, quiet steps, they transported the entire sum to the root cellar, hidden beneath Margaret's own examination room. A place no one would ever think to look. Once the treasure was secured, Margaret went to check on Billy and Walt. She then settled into her familiar chair by the window, her gaze fixed on the dark, empty main street, and she waited. She just waited for the sun to rise, for the inevitable to arrive, and arrive it did. Victor Crane rode into town precisely at 10 o'clock, with a posse of 9 grim-faced men trailing behind him like a shadow. Margaret was already waiting, standing tall on the steps of her building when he reined in his horse. She had decided that waiting inside, cowering behind walls, felt too much like hiding. And she was absolutely done with hiding. Crane was a man of contrasts. He was small, almost disappointingly so, and immaculately dressed. He looked like he belonged behind a desk in a city office, shuffling papers. But that very neatness, that out-of-place civility, somehow made him all the more frightening, not less. His voice was calm, almost casual, as he spoke. "Where is Red Donahue?" he asked, his eyes scanning the street. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "He left this morning," she replied, her voice steady. Crane's lips curved into a semblance of a smile. "I think you know where he went," he pressed. Margaret's response was simple and direct. "I think you are wrong." With a flick of his wrist, Crane ordered his men to search every single building in the town. As they stormed her clinic, Margaret stood resolutely in the doorway of each room, her presence a silent, watchful challenge. She watched them tear through her belongings, her supplies, her life. One of the men, burly and rough, started to pull at her examination table. Her voice, though quiet, cut through the noise of the search. "There is a patient on that table," she stated, not as a request, but as a fact. Lying there, with his eyes closed and his breathing deep and steady, was Walt Briggs. Margaret had placed him there just an hour before Crane's arrival, carefully explaining the plan. Walt had looked at her, bewildered. "You want me to just lie on a table and pretend to be asleep?" he'd asked. "No," Margaret had corrected him gently. "I want you to lie on a table and listen. And most importantly, be ready." The first, thorough search of her building yielded nothing. The men reported back to Crane, their faces showing their frustration. Crane, unfazed, rode his horse to the very center of the street, his voice now booming so everyone in town could hear. "Where's the money?" he demanded. Margaret, still standing on her steps, projected her voice to meet his. "I do not know what money you mean," she called back, her defiance hanging in the tense air. A chilling silence fell over the town. Crane dismounted slowly, walking towards her, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust. He stopped just a few feet away, his gaze boring into her. "I am going to give you one opportunity," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "One chance to tell me what I want to know. After that," he paused, letting the threat sink in, "I become significantly less pleasant." The air crackled with unspoken violence, and Margaret knew this was just the beginning. The whole town was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. She had made her choice, and now she would have to face the consequences, whatever they might be. Thank you for watching. And be sure to follow for the next part of the story. Margaret looked at Crane and said, I have been a frontier nurse for 3 years. I've set broken bones without anesthetic. I've delivered babies in the middle of blizzards. I have seen far worse than you, and I am still here." While she spoke, Red came in from the north road, moving quietly. Walt swung his legs off the table, grabbing his badge and rifle. 3 townsmen, who had been waiting for their cue, took their positions, their faces grim and determined. Crane's eyes darted around the room. He saw Red, he saw Walt, he saw the townsmen. His men were surrounded, caught completely off guard. He turned his gaze back to Margaret, a look of disbelief on his face. He said, his voice low and dangerous, "You planned this." She met his glare without flinching. "I am a nurse," she said simply. "I make plans, it's what I do." Just then, Walt's voice cut through the tension, firm and unwavering. "Victor Crane, you are under arrest." A heavy silence hung in the air. Then, one by one, Crane's men slowly raised their hands in surrender. Finally, Crane himself, defeated, raised his. Last of all, the U.S. Marshal arrived 4 days later. He sat with Margaret in her small office for 2 long hours, listening intently as she recounted the events. When she finished, he looked at her with a deep respect. "Texas owes you a great debt, ma'am," he said. Margaret just shook her head slightly. "Send us a real doctor," she replied. That was all she wanted. That night, as the moon cast long shadows across the dusty street, Red appeared at her door. He stood there for a moment, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "That first morning," he began, his voice hesitant, "when Crane rode in, were you not afraid?" Margaret looked out the window, at the quiet town she had fought for. "I was terrified," she admitted softly. Red seemed puzzled. "Then why?" He asked, "Why did you stand up to him?" She turned back to him, her expression clear and steady. "Walt Briggs needed help," she said, "and I was the only help there was. That's always the reason, isn't it? You do what you must." Red nodded slowly, a new understanding in his eyes. He put his hat back on, gave her a small, respectful tip of the brim, and walked out into the night. Margaret sat down in her worn chair by the window, the same chair where she had faced down a notorious outlaw. She looked out at her town. It was safe for now, but it was still a frontier town, a place that would always need someone to stand up for it, to care for it. She was still here. And for now, that was enough. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe for more Western stories every week.